The night had begun like any other in the sprawling mansion of billionaire Armin Malik, a man whose fortune stretched across continents and whose influence touched corners of the world he had never even set foot in. His estate, perched on a hill overlooking the glittering city, was a fortress of glass and marble, guarded by state-of-the-art security systems and a staff trained to cater to his every whim. Inside, the house glowed with the quiet hum of wealth, every polished surface gleaming, every corner pristine. Armin sat in his study, a vast room lined with mahogany shelves, sipping from a glass of deep red Bordeaux. The clock ticked softly in the background, marking time with a steady rhythm that matched the calm rise and fall of his breath. For once, his world felt peaceful. In the background, Lila, his maid, moved silently as she always did. She was a woman in her mid-30s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a posture that carried quiet discipline. Though her job was to serve, she carried herself with the grace of someone who had lived through storms and learned to walk through them unshaken. Her movements were efficient yet almost invisible. She entered, cleaned, adjusted, and left without fanfare, like a shadow in the life of the man she worked for. Armin barely paid her much attention. To him, she was just another presence in his household, one of many who ensured his world remained comfortable. He had never asked where she came from, what her dreams were, or why she always had that unshakable calm about her. But fate was about to strip away that invisibility. At 10:47 p.m., the calm shattered. The first sound was faint, a sharp crack of glass from downstairs. Armin frowned, setting down his wine glass. Before he could process, the second sound came, hurried footsteps, heavy and deliberate. His blood froze. The alarms, why weren't they going off? He reached for his phone, but before his fingers touched it, the study doors burst open. 4 masked men stormed in, their presence swallowing the room like a wave of darkness. Their guns gleamed under the chandelier light, their movements sharp, voices harsh and commanding. "Sit down. Don't move," the leader barked, his tone leaving no room for disobedience. Armin's heart hammered in his chest. For a moment, he thought this must be some kind of mistake. How could they have bypassed the cameras, the guards, the gates? But the cold barrel of a gun pressed against his temple erased any illusion. He stumbled backward, collapsing into the leather chair behind his desk, his hands trembling uncontrollably. The intruders moved swiftly, one keeping his weapon trained on Armin, another rifling through drawers, while the remaining 2 spread out across the mansion. Their boots echoed against the polished floor, and every second felt like an eternity. Armin's mind raced. He had billions at his disposal, surely they only wanted money, valuables, anything they could carry. He could give them whatever they wanted. His lips parted, stammering, "Take the cash, the safes, the jewels, I'll give you everything. Please, just don't." But his voice faltered when his gaze shifted across the room. Because there, standing near the far wall with a silver tray still in her hands, was Lila. Her face was unreadable, her breathing steady. The chaos around her, the shouting, the waving guns, the threat of violence, seemed not to penetrate her composure. She looked at the intruders the way one might look at a sudden storm, unflinching, watchful, but not afraid. On the floor, one of the masked men snapped at her, waving his weapon in her direction. Now, for the first time since the break-in began, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Armin expected her to scream, to panic, to collapse like anyone else would. But Lila didn't move the way they expected. Instead, she carefully lowered the tray onto a nearby table, the soft clink of silverware cutting through the tension like a calm heartbeat. Straightening, she folded her hands in front of her, her eyes steady as she looked at the man aiming the gun. "You don't want to do this," she said softly. Her voice was not desperate. It was not trembling. It was steady, so steady that it unsettled even Armin, who sat frozen in his chair. The leader of the intruders scoffed. "Shut up, lady. You don't get to talk." He advanced toward her, his gun raised higher. One more word but she didn't flinch. Armin could hardly comprehend it. He, a man who had faced hostile business rivals, government threats, and courtroom battles, was trembling like a leaf. And yet his maid, someone he barely noticed most days, stood in the face of armed men with a calmness that seemed almost otherworldly. The robbers weren't sure how to react. They had expected terror, screaming, compliance. But instead, here was a woman looking at them as though she had already seen past their masks, as though she knew something about them they didn't want revealed. Lila took a small step forward, her tone still even. Do you think this will end well? Guns don't bring peace. Violence doesn't bring riches. You're not here for this house, you're here because something is broken inside you. Her words cut through the air sharper than the weapons they carried. One of the younger intruders shifted uncomfortably, lowering his eyes. Another tightened his grip on his gun, his jaw clenched. The leader, though visibly agitated, didn't pull the trigger. Something in her voice, something in her unshaken demeanor, held them back. Armin's eyes darted between her and the men, his own breath shallow. He wanted to intervene, to shout at her to stop provoking them, but he couldn't speak. Deep inside, a strange realization dawned on him. The balance of power in the room had shifted. Not because of him, the billionaire. Not because of the guns. But because of the maid who stood calm in the storm. And in that moment, Armin Malik understood, though he did not yet know how, that his life was about to change forever. Armin Malik could not believe his eyes. In the heart of his mansion, surrounded by masked men with weapons drawn, the person who seemed to hold all the power was not him. The billionaire whose name commanded respect across boardrooms, but his maid, Lila. Her calmness was like a shield, invisible yet unbreakable. Armin had seen hardened CEOs, ruthless tycoons, even corrupt politicians, men who controlled empires with iron fists, but none had ever carried themselves the way she did in that moment. The leader of the robbers still had his gun trained on her. Sit down. Now, he barked, his voice cracking with the faintest edge of uncertainty. But Lila didn't obey. She took another careful step forward, her eyes never leaving his. Her voice remained steady, soft but piercing. You don't want to pull that trigger. You know what happens if you do. Your life ends here, not with a bullet in me, but with chains on you. Is that the story you want your family to remember? The man hesitated. His hands shook just slightly, and Armin, sitting helpless in his chair, noticed. The younger of the intruders shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the leader as if seeking direction. You think you're in control, Lila continued, her voice gaining a quiet strength, but you're not. This house has cameras. The police are already on their way. Even if you leave now, you won't make it far. The only choice you have is whether to ruin your life completely, or walk away with some dignity. The words seemed to crack open something in the room. For a moment, it wasn't guns and threats, it was conscience. Shut up. The leader growled, his voice rising, but his tone betrayed the panic that Lila's composure had ignited. He hadn't come here for this. He had expected fear, submission, easy money. Not a maid who spoke to him as if she could see into his soul. Armin sat frozen, his mind reeling. He thought of all the times he had walked past Lila without a second glance, all the years she had worked quietly in his home, unnoticed. And now, here she was, protecting him with nothing but her courage. Do you have children? She asked suddenly, her eyes narrowing slightly behind her calm expression. The leader stiffened. He didn't answer, but the way his shoulders tensed told the truth. Then think of them, Lila pressed on. What will they remember? That their father was a thief who destroyed lives for money. Or that he found the courage to stop before it was too late. Her words pierced deeper than any weapon could. The leader's breathing grew heavier. His grip on the gun loosened, almost imperceptibly. The younger intruder, his mask slipping slightly, spoke in a low, trembling voice. She's right, this isn't worth it. Shut up. The leader snapped, but the cracks in his authority were widening. Another of the robbers shifted his weight, looking toward the door as though reconsidering everything. And then Lila did something that made Armin's heart stop. She stepped closer, deliberately, carefully, and extended her hand. Her palm was open, steady, and in spoken invitation. Give me the gun, she said softly. For a long moment, no one moved. The chandelier lights above flickered faintly, casting shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly across the room. Armin held his breath, his pulse pounding so loud he could hear it in his ears. The leader stared at her, his mask unable to hide the turmoil in his eyes. The gun wavered. His hand shook. And then, against every expectation, he placed the weapon into her waiting palm. The silence that followed was deafening. The other robbers froze, stunned. One of them cursed under his breath. The younger man took off his mask entirely, his face pale with guilt. And then, like dominoes, they began to follow. One dropped his gun with a clatter on the polished floor. Another raised his hands slowly, eyes darting nervously toward the windows. Within minutes, the room transformed from a battlefield to something else entirely, a surrender. Lila stood there, holding the gun with a calm that seemed almost unreal. She didn't point it at them, didn't wave it around. She simply held it firmly, her eyes never wavering. When the distant wail of sirens broke through the night air, none of the robbers moved to run. They seemed trapped, not by walls, but by the weight of the woman standing before them. By the time the police stormed in, weapons drawn, they were met not with chaos but with surrendering criminals and a billionaire still trembling in disbelief. Officers moved swiftly, cuffing the intruders, collecting the weapons, securing the scene. But it wasn't the arrests that would be remembered. It was the sight of Lila, calm, composed, still holding the gun she had taken from the man who had threatened them minutes earlier. News traveled fast. By the next morning, every media outlet carried the story. Maid diffuses armed robbery with unshakable calm. Headlines splashed her name across the world. Interviews poured in, journalists clamored to speak to her, and cameras waited outside the mansion gates. Armin Malik watched in awe as the woman he had once overlooked became a global symbol of courage. She was invited onto talk shows, honored by community leaders, even contacted by international organizations that wanted her to share her story. But through it all, Lila remained the same, quiet, composed, almost humble. When asked how she had stayed so calm, she would smile faintly and say, "Fear doesn't solve problems. Someone has to stay steady when everything else falls apart." For Armin, the night had shaken him to his core. He realized that all his wealth, his influence, his power, none of it had saved him. It was the maid he had barely noticed for years who had stood between him and death. One evening, weeks after the incident, he sat with her in the study, the same room where it had all happened. His voice was softer than it had ever been. "Lila," he said, "I owe you my life. Whatever you want, money, a business, anything, it's yours." She shook her head gently. "I don't need riches, sir. I just need dignity. A chance to live a life of meaning. That's enough for me." Her words humbled him more than the robbery ever could. And as the world continued to marvel at the maid who had tamed armed men with nothing but her courage, Armin Malik carried a truth that would never leave him. That night, he had witnessed the power of calm in the face of chaos, and it had changed him forever. The world had been shaken. But no one more than him.